We're live here. I'm Diana Flatto, Assistant Curator at America's Society, and we'll be live as part of our In the Studio series with Gala Porras-Kim. And we'll be connecting with her in just a second. So thank you all again for joining us. Here we are with Gala. Thank you.
Hi.
So we are here with America's Society for In the Studio. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm here in my apartment in Brooklyn, and Gala, who we'll be hearing more about, is an artist born in Colombia, based currently in Los Angeles, where she is now in her studio. So
yes.
Thank you
Hi.
again. And I don't know if you want to start. I know you have a really interesting studio space, and not all artists have access to their studios right now. If you want to just give us a look around, and then we'll dive into the work.
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting me. I have been camping out this quarantine in my studio so I can... Whoa, what is that? I think I turned
I think there's a filter.
Yeah, so I've been camping out in the studio since we're not allowed to go outside. So I thought that if I couldn't really go anywhere, it would be more productive, or try to be productive, if I was here. But my studio is old bank, very, very old bank. There's not many brick buildings in LA. There's like a vault.
It's so interesting.
Yeah, and then, it's a lot of bricks and a lot of stuff. And I've been just sorting it, very slowly while I've been here trying to figure out how to remake a studio now that, things are not accessible so much.
Sure.
But luckily enough, I have been always making most of my work myself. So in a sense, it's very self-contained, but it's also such a crazy move because I was actually during a fellowship at Harvard during the year, and so I had to pack my studio and then move here and then unpack and close everything and reopen. So it was a lot of moving, and now it's just trying to figure out how to live and make something.
Sure. So we can start talking about your work. One thing that's really interesting about your practice is how deeply you research everything from language to objects to history. I was going to talk about one of those projects.
Yeah. And so then I just did a sort of, I guess we can figure out how to share. I'm so tech low, but I have some slides.
I can share some of the images on my end.
Okay.
Give me just a second.
Let's see if it works.
Yeah, there we are.
Oh,
go through that.
Okay. Great. Yeah, so, many of the projects that I've made, I actually just started with my interest in language here in Mexico. And so I started making this project to try and figure out how it was that I could make works within an institutional setting. And so actually, after I finished grad school, I enrolled again at UCLA to study Zapotec and figure out how to make this record, which you can see, which is a translation of the spoken Zapotec into its whistle tones. And in the process of making this project, how do we move? Okay, so click or...
Oh, I'll have to go through those.
Okay, so yeah, I just wanted the first couple of slides was just these works that I made while to figure out if the process of learning something could generate actual work. So in a sense, instead of having a studio practice, how I could make class be the studio, no? So this is like works that I was just making while I was there. Next. This is when I tried to learn how to whistle in school and it was not really working out. So I ended up making online version on the computer anyway. But in the end, next, let's just go through that's a score of that record. So what ended up happening was that presented this project mostly in historical conferences before I showed it in a gallery. So because I wanted to test out by default, all of these works would end up being artworks, but how could I also make them exist in this other sort of academic world, no? Next. Yeah, so then through the process of making this record, I actually started being interested in how my teacher at the time, who was teaching me Zapotec, was making this dictionary of the Zapotec language, which was a tonal language. And so he was actually deciding how the spelling of all of these words would exist. And so in a sense, for me, what was interesting was to see the process of fitting this idea, you know, the tonal language or meaning into the specific forms, which is ABC in this case, which to me was just very difficult to like square away. Next.
And how did you, sorry to interrupt, but
yeah.
how did you actually become interested in the Zapotec language?
I mean, I live in LA, so it's really a lot of Oaxacan community here, and I have a lot of friends from there. And I remember that many of the people that I used to work for an architect. So when I was working with them, many of the people who we worked with were from Oaxaca, and they spoke Zapotec to each other. And I thought that it was just the coolest thing. And when at the time I was making works, but that were music and language and how they would sort of blend into each other. And I thought like a tonal language is doing that all in one. And at the time, you know, I was like, maybe I can learn Chinese. But then, you know, Chinese has already been so figured out that it was more interesting to actually try and learn Zapotec, because also I wanted to just go to Mexico a lot. So I was like, how can I make it be so the subject of my work can actually be like workation style, and I would end up there a lot, you know? Like manifesting it or something. So then these are just signs that I made actually in Mexico that were asking different Zapotec Oaxacan stores to how would their existing signage would be spelled in Zapotec, because the idea was to figure out how the written form could come from an individual instead of a top-down sort of section. Like if the spelling is being made now, any version could exist in a way. And so these are just like these pictures of installations there of just the existing signage and the spelling that each of the people who own the stores made up. Next.
Sure. And I'm sorry, my little thumbnail is covering part of the images.
Oh, yeah. No. So this is going on to the next project, which was, you know, I started looking at all of these artifacts, which was the last time the Zapotec people themselves wrote their own language. Before it was like Spanish people or like Mixtec people, all these other people, right? And then I started looking, and then it was in all of these artifacts that were undeciphered. So in a sense, I wanted to do like internships with a lot of us, with archaeologists, just to figure out how to get access to these stones, or how they're actually like categorized or handled, or all of this stuff. And so then later I found this, it's called La Mojarra Stela, which is like the most amazing rock in the world, I think. And what was interesting to me about this rock was that the way that it was found was like the most anticlimactic way, that it was like this fisherman who was at the Papaloapan, and then he was just fishing, and he felt like a smooth stone at the bottom of the river, and then they pulled it out, and it was this rock that was just like holds all of this text that nobody can actually really understand. So in a sense, it sort of, not that it gave me hope, but it was the idea that anybody in a daily life could actually find or like run into like something that cool, no? But this is the rock that I ended up basing my Whitney Biennial project, which was this installation of 3.5 interpretations of the stone. So the first one is this one on the left, which I think is a slide. The next one is a close-up of it, which is how to separate all of the text that existed by their shapes. So these are, this box in front of it is sort of this viewing device that you look through to see the drawing of the stone. I wanted to make the drawing life size. I think that the next slide is took a picture of it in my studio. I guess there's not to scale, but this thing is like 9 feet tall or something. Because in my idea, it was just like maybe at some point it could be shown next to the real one and they would be like twins or something. But if you go back one slide, you can see that this viewing device has 5 different transparencies, which in an ideal setting you would be able to take out and align and just see like all the circles in the text, or all the squares, or all the, what is it? Purple is like all the faces. 5 different categories. I can't remember anymore, but let me see. Yes, so that's number 1. Next. This one, I've been also looking at these. I've been making a series of these works that are based on obsidian mirrors. So I was actually interested, also sort of like my side project at the time was to figure out how to access history in a different way, maybe like through past life regression or different divination things, or how to experience history first person and not through like some sort of historical document, but how can one actually go there. And so I was looking at like obsidian mirrors, which were used for divination in Mexico before, and so this work is based on that. But I thought of it as kind of like a play, where the audience would be looking at this object, looking at itself in this mirror. Does that make sense? So in a sense, we're not the main audience. It's just like you're watching this thing happening, where this rock is looking at itself to try and figure out what it's about. And so the holes in the figure in front. Let me explain it. So the backdrop is a graphite drawing, which it's all graphite, which makes this like reflection. So it actually works as a mirror in a sense. And then the object in front of it is this mojarra with all of the damage or cut out parts that are missing. So the idea was that it was looking into the mirror to try and figure out what the missing bits were, no? Like perpetually.
So we have a question asking if you could speak about how you envision your work as an intervention in a broader scope of artists who have been interested in engaging the pre-Hispanic past and its material traces. So you might be answering this as you're going along speaking about your work.
Oh my gosh, that's like a long sentence.
It's a big question. We can think about it and get back to it maybe at the end.
Yeah, I'm like speaking mode and like answering question mode. Let me see. How interesting in your way. Okay, maybe can we answer the question after?
Yeah, that's fine.
So the third 3.5 version was this drawing, and then the next image, which is this disc. So together they make 3.5, because the idea for this, so if you go back one image, the backdrop is this difficult to see. I took a picture of it in my studio with flash because the work is made with glass beads, so you can actually just see the text when it's flashed, or the light has to be very specific. So in a sense, the circle thing was the light device that would light up the backdrop. And so the way that this piece works is that the original structure of the stone, the text structure, is the way that the text is organized in the backdrop, and then the light source is this disc that is rotating, and it has, if you go forward, it has these same text inside, but because the disc is rotating, the characters become randomized. So in a sense, you can't really predict the combination of language that it will make, and then it lights this backdrop that has a set structure already. So together, it would make this, organized version and like randomized version. And my hope was that at some point they would join together, and it would be those moments that would be actually the work. I'm like, that's where the magic has, like when you can see the randomized version and the existing version come together. And I actually got an email from somebody who went to the show and said that they were there in the moment in which it lined up, even without them knowing that was actually the point of the the piece. And so I was just like, success. He was like, I was looking at the thing, and at one point they were aligned, and I was like, one, no? Yeah, so those were the 3.5. I think, what was the next slide? Yeah, so in the process of making all of these works, I've been working a lot with collections, ethnographic collections around. This is a project that I made at the Hammer. If you know, the Hammer Museum and the Fowler Museum are both part of UCLA. One is a contemporary museum, one is an ethnographic museum, and they kind of are separate from each other. And so when I was invited to make this show, I wanted to work with the ethnographic collection. And so when I went there, I found that they had this shelf of uncatalogued artifacts that basically had lost their cataloging numbers, so people didn't know what they were, where they came from, or what, no? But all of the objects had these Post-its on it that basically was just projections of different curators or conservators through the time that the objects was in the collection, just trying to think what it could have been at some point. So for example, this mud ring, it says Africa, ? And then underneath it says Bali, ? So in a sense, it was just like, and then later somebody put this Post-it that says no. So and many of them had this conversation through time of like past conservators, past curators, and then they would edit each other as time went by. And so for me, it was just like such a mirroring of a historical record where one fact that you might think is a true fact later will get debunked and be like, now we know more information. Now this other thing is actually the real truth until somebody else comes and debunks it, on and on. So next. So for the project I borrowed all of these objects from the Fowler and put them in the Hammer in this installation, which I made some works that were based on these Post-it notes that the people had made. And so, for example, I think I put next. Yeah, so for example, the works that I made were in these triptychs. So if you see this one here with the big blue base, the objects on it are the actual artifacts from the Fowler, and then the ceramic, and then the drawing behind it. That's the triptych or three-part work. And so then the base had this note that said that of course, the information they didn't know, but at some point, those objects, which was basically trash, had been in a collection, in like a collector's home who had a ceramic. So this ceramic had he basically had the ceramic and he put all of this trash bits inside of it and he donated it to the Fowler as a whole object. And so when the object got cataloged, even the objects within became part of the object. And so then afterwards, the ceramic got lost. So then all that was left was this trash that said that it at one point belonged to a ceramic. And so my project was basically to find these instances in which objects in the collection had these physical notes to recreate the reconstruction of it, which is this ceramic object that actually holds the object within them to make one object. And then the drawing, which is the documentation of them actually being together, because once the exhibition is over, the artifacts will go back to the ethnographic museum, and then all that we have is these two other bits that are holding that whole entire story, And so then if you see underneath, there was also all of these other objects, and so I borrowed them with the Post-it notes so people could see all of the sort of historical editing that was happening within the collection. Next. This is another one. So it's like, the shapes themselves are pretty arbitrary. For example, that grass thing, the note was just like this grass skirt underneath was at one point part of a larger piece of grass. So like any shape, larger piece of grass will actually do, Next. And so then I also started to make a series of works that were based on textile fragments. So, before when people wanted to conserve textile fragments, they would actually glue them or sew them into another piece of fabric to make them stabilized. Now they don't do that anymore, but then I found this specific, 20 little dinosaur bits that had been sewn into this mesh. So what was interesting to me of this object was that in the process of conserving the works, the conservator made a new object. So he actually made a brand new sheet, like textile piece, and decided where all of these new dinosaurs would be placed. And based on this new object, that's what the drawing is based off of. So the image in the back that you see is just the pattern that somebody decided, repeated. So it's a reconstruction of the new version of that object. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, good. And so then I actually have been just collecting like all of these pictures of, fabric bits that people just glue on together. And I think that there's some really amazing, for example, the Ashmolean collection has an amazing conservator at one point that was actually making full pattern designs off of the way that he glued them onto the backing. So in a sense, it was like, this is actually an individual author that is a conservator who is actually using these found objects to make this new composition.
Which is so interesting because generally the conservator's job is for their hand to not be shown.
No, yes, I know. But in a sense, you cannot make, they can't not make aesthetic choices on how the objects are made. So in a sense, that's why I'm so interested in conservation, because those people are actually the ones that are taking also the artist's hand, because they're actually intervening in the physical shape of the object, as opposed to like curators who, when they like present your work, they are doing a conceptual framing of your idea or whatever, but the conservator themselves is actually intervening in the physical shape. Next. Yeah. So then I got into this forms. So now I've been just like really into, once I started working with institutions, I thought that that all of the ways that the forms and classifications of these objects was even more interesting than the physical anything that was happening, because when I borrowed the objects from the Fowler to the Hammer, they had to make a loan form in which they had to come up with the titles of like what descriptions of these objects that had no idea. So it was like, what is it? How much is it? Like for insurance, all these loan form information. And so then in a sense, it was just like prompting the institution to have to come up with information that comes out of nowhere, no? And so this is actually just it's not a work, but for me, it was like the coolest thing, where it was the map for the exhibition in which all of the titles, which the curator and registrar and the Fowler people decided to name their things. And next, I think I put an example. Oh no, go back. That's it. So for example, there was like, I love the Goonies rock. So because there was a stone with a hole in it, and I was just joking that it looked like the rock from the Goonies. And so now officially it's called the Goonies rock, sort of as a placeholder name until more information comes up, or like whatever, no? Because it could be anything if it doesn't exist, no? And I thought that it was, one of the things that was interesting to me was that the more difficult it is to accept as a real truth, like, of course it's not Goonies rock, but then it becomes a more honest way of recording a historical document, because you're not pretending like you actually know. Like the ones that are really close, it's really hard to separate the fact that people might not actually know. So when I go to an ethnographic museum and the label is really clear looking, it's hard to question it, because it really feels like it could be like an authority saying this is a fact, when it's really like maybe 50% fact. I don't know.
Right. It's harder to distinguish from
exactly
complete ridiculous.
Yeah. So then the next work was this idea that, for the next piece, I've been collecting all of these Southwest artifacts. And so I made a reconstruction of this shard. That was it. So I figured out how to, technically make the reconstruction, like how do conservators actually fill in stuff. So materially, it's like, the piece can be removed and it's archival and all of these things. But the shape is this like really abstract form, because it's, like I said, it's it's not looking like it could have been this abstract shape originally. No, maybe it's like if I would have made a cup shape, then it would be harder to say like why. Of course, it could be a cup more than it could be this abstract form. No, and so the project was that, and then I also donated it to the Hammer because they have no antiquities in their collection. So in a sense, I was interested in how the building itself would define what the object was, because I made actual reconstruction, but then once the museum accessioned it into their collection, it became a work of art. And so then I was thinking, okay, if it, at one point it shows up the Fowler, would it actually become an artifact at one point? And so the building itself would define what the, the conditions of this specific object. Next. Yes, so then I also made one for the Whitney because I was like, which collection doesn't have any antiquities? This was actually for the installation for the last, not this past, but the past
2016, right?
16 or 17, 17 Whitney Biennial. That was the installation of Rafa Esparza, who's a close friend of mine, and he was making this Adobe bricks installation. And so he actually invited artists to interact with this installation that he made. And of course, I was like, I have all of these Southwest reconstructions, artifact reconstructions, which in the past probably was installed in a type of setting like this, because in the Southwest, all of the Adobe buildings are there, no? Yes, and so that's all of the documents, etc. Next. Yes, so in terms of the forms, I made this project in France also that was similar to that, but it actually was more about these legal documents about who could own those artifacts, you know, because I'm interested in just also the legal definitions that actually define like what is it or who owns it or how does it live in a specific moment. And so these objects actually were for an installation in Marseille. And so I had to do research on French law, and this is a letter from the lawyer that actually accompanies those works, that it's basically saying that nobody can own the entire works because it's divided into three owners. It's me, the property owner, because I found these shards in the site next to where I was living, in the trash basically, and then the French state. So the state, the owner, and me who found it is this trifecta of people. And so then in a sense, I really like the idea that these objects would never be able to be owned by one person, and it's always just moving around, in the same as all the historical, all the things that are historical. Because when I was thinking about collections, it was it's difficult to see right now that museums would ever go away, but really the museum that houses all of these artifacts is just taking such a small time in the life of that specific object. That object has been around for thousands of years in the museum, only for a couple, relative short amount of time. So the objects are probably going to outlive the box that it's doing. So it's just oh yeah, during my thousands, I'm in this box, and then later it would be a new one. No? Next. Yes. So this is the Art of the Ancient Americas building. Well, that doesn't exist anymore, actually, because LACMA is remodeled, so this building does not exist. Next. But I made this project about the West Mexico ceramic collection that is there, because when I went to this room, it all of the labels had the collector who sold the collection to LACMA in the 60s or 70s. His name was Proctor Stafford. So for me, it was interesting to see that in this room, his name appeared 300 times, and the objects were sort of second. For me, it felt secondary in a sense, where it was maybe this exhibition is about this man and his collecting, which is fine. But the room itself is presenting we're trying to access some historical past that we might not actually know. And so then I wanted to also draw all of the artifacts, because drawing is such a base part of my practice, and because it's so slow, I can actually I have to stare at the works for so long that I have memorized every single one. So in a sense, it's slowing down the visual learning process or whatever. So I actually did three of these drawings that are these indexes of the collection, but divided into three different states, because some of them were from Jalisco, Nayarit, and Colima, but they were all categorized as West Mexico. And actually, it just came up recently that it's maybe they will not be called Jalisco in the future. So then I should update the work so they're just latitude and longitude instead of a specific name, because that in the future will actually change. or the country or the culture, the things that are labeling it after. But these drawings are just organized same, like the sort of real arbitrary, not arbitrary, but they're organized by size, which is like basically one of the only factual things we know about these works, besides the fact that they were found in graves. Next. This is the second one. This is, I can't even read that one. Is that like Nayarit? Yes. Yeah, and so by separating them into these three different states, I also was able to see that they had different, different qualities. So for example, this one, like the ladies are sitting in this specific way with their legs like that, which doesn't appear in the other ones. And then, and anyway, there's so many like interesting things about individual ones, but maybe later. Next. And so during that exhibition time, I made 3 different projects about the collection, and one of them was the known provenance of where the works were from. So this show was actually at Labor in Mexico City, and so I thought that I would make a show about the known provenance, and so this is a photorealistic drawing of a grave because most of these objects were coming from graves. And so it's called, I forgot, just the grave. Next. And it was known that many of these artifacts, before they were sold to the LACMA, I heard this interview by Proctor Stafford with one of the LACMA curators saying that they were used to adorn mantles all over the place before. So then it was this moment in which the function of these objects stopped being whatever ritual original grave thing might have been, and now they were just adorning mantles, no? And so the next one would be that they're like historical objects at LACMA, right? And so I wanted to just sort of, this idea that the box in which the objects are placed, whether it's in a home or a museum or underneath, would change the function of it, and that all of those different functions would live inside of the object and sort of accumulate. Next. So this one is for the future. I mean, one of the conversations that I had with the curator was that there is a lot of problems with provenance because it's hard to keep track of where stuff came from or where, I don't know, like tons of, I mean, basically they don't know very much before the 70s. And so I made these ceramics that are based off of general shapes in the collection, and these objects have a GPS tracker attached to them. So for the future, they will be like the best cataloged objects because every time that they move from not super Big Brother style, but every time they move, then the new location gets cataloged. But really, I was trying to figure out how not to make it so like, oh, you moved it from your bedroom to your bathroom type of thing, but more like voluntary where, whenever one of those places actually really moves from location to location, then the person who has them would contact me and then the information would be voluntarily updated. In that sense, it would just like probably many of them will drop out, because it's not, yeah, of course, technology can actually help us keep track of all of these things, but it seems to me that it's like a collective effort to maintain the memory of where the objects are.
And we have a question whether you still keep track of them.
Yeah, I mean, they haven't really moved all that much in 2017, so yes. Next. This is the last one. Next. So that third section was the one that was actually shown at LACMA with this letter, which was actually the main idea for the project, which was to ask the institution, how come Proctor Stafford is still attached to this collection? Or does it ever expire, this sort of labeling, no? Because I was thinking that, the policy of the institution is what's regulating this cataloging. And, Proctor Stafford is actually dead and he has no estate or kids or anything. So it's really the museum itself who's maintaining this name there. And so this is just a letter that was actually not exhibited. So it was printed in the catalog, which is just asking questions about how, private collectors' names and public collections objects, do they ever separate? Because the provenance, when Proctor Stafford sold the objects to LACMA, didn't get updated because it's not the Proctor Stafford. It was the Proctor Stafford collection at one point, and then it was the LACMA collection next when it moved. But, you know, there's these like strange collector loopholes that is basically how you can buy, you know, how private collectors can build their legacies with this public history, you know? So that's something that I'm really interested in continuing doing. Next. Yes, so this is another project that I've made that was, so in LACMA, while I was making all of this work, they had a show in Teotihuacan, like new finds of Teotihuacan, because they have been using all of this technology to like scan the ground and they don't even have to open anything. And they found this tunnel in Teotihuacan and made a show about it. But what was interesting to me was that they had these two stones in the show that were so anti-climate, like one is 6 foot and one is 8 foot, kind of giant, but no carving and nothing. And these two stones were found at the top of the inside of the top of the Sun Pyramid of Teotihuacan, no? So like right here, no? And so for me, that they didn't find it before and they had to use like super crazy technology to find it, and then they dug it out because it was definitely not meant for a human audience. It sort of meant that those rocks were not for us to consume or like do, because these are like ritual sites in which maybe because somebody spent a lot of energy trying to get these rocks to the top, had some sort of really important significance to the functioning of the pyramid or something about it that maybe by taking them out we have disrupted. No? Because I was like, okay, if this is like some sacred site and then you're basically taking out the battery, what happens? No? And so now it's like COVID, no, whatever.
Sure, maybe we've solved it.
No, but it's just, you know, the things that we don't know, it's just questioning how, you know, all of these excavating, especially with ritual objects and objects that are meant to be buried with people and spiritual things, since actually nobody has an idea if that works or not, we can't be like, let's just move it around without actually taking into account that we might be moving stuff, no? So this project is actually... Yeah, so then this project is basically, I made a replica of this stone, which was like another really interesting sort of legal loophole because Mexico owns the copyright of all the antiquities of the country. So in order to be able to make a replica, I had to ask the INA to give me a license to copy it. And so then I made this copy, and then the work is this replica with this letter to them to say, hey, I will donate this thing so you can put it back into the hole of the pyramid as a placeholder. So at least if there's a spiritual entity looking at it, it would be like those humans at least tried and not just pretend like we didn't even think about it. You know, maybe because for me, it's not necessarily about actually fixing anything because there's no fixing. I don't know how to fix anything. It's just more acknowledging the fact that something has happened when, you know, through the process of historicizing or archaeology, stuff gets moved around, and it's not just about learning about the past because those objects might still be functioning.
Sure.
Next. So now we can so those were sort of the last projects that I'm making, and so these are sort of the 3 last slides that are works that I'm trying to make now. So this is actually very side note. Okay, so full another presentation. So I was supposed to have the show at Caddis in New York like last month, and so it obviously everything got moved, and this is the ones that I'm working on, which is these 12 drawings of Göbekli Tepe, which is the oldest. It used to be the oldest temple in the world until a couple of months ago when they found a tiny bit older one. But at the time, it was the oldest temple. And there's an idea that this temple was built 12,000 years ago to commemorate the first time that Sirius, the star, popped out of the horizon. No, so it's like aligned and then Sirius, whatever. No, and so then the exhibition is 12 drawings of 12 different times of the day. Of the same site, but there are 2 parts of the drawing. The sky I went to an observatory and was able to take pictures of how the sky looked like 12,000 years ago to fact check if for real Sirius popped out from the sky, and in fact it did. And so the top half of the drawing is the sky south facing 12,000 years old image, and then the bottom is actually current day Göbekli Tepe but facing northeast. So I wanted to and along with the exhibition, there's these 12 different interpretations of the site. So it's like an archaeological site explaining what the site was. There's like a Zoroastrian priest talking about how the site was specifically a Zoroastrian site. There's an ancient aliens version. There's like a kids movie version. There's a version of like the wind blowing around in the actual structure. So these 12 different, not even human interpretations per se, but like all across the border. But the idea was to see how these two instances, or 12 at this, the sound ones, can actually exist in the same plane and look so normal, but they actually technically cannot live in the same world. So it's basically they can exist in the image. For me, this image looks so boring, like of course that's the sky and the ground, no? But in a sense, it's really not able to exist because one is facing one way and one's facing the other way and in way different times, no? Yes, but that will be on view soon enough. Whenever.
I can't wait to see it.
Yes, and so the next two slides is the oh my God, this is like so not even made yet, but so this is a project that is based on Chichen Itza. The one I was doing at Harvard was looking at the Peabody collection because there's all of these legal documents of how the artifacts that were dredged out of the cenote at Chichen Itza arrived at the Peabody in Cambridge. And that was through, like legal ownership of the property in which the cenote is on. So like there was this man who bought the land in which the cenote was on because he could excavate it then legally, as opposed to the state owning all of the man-made structures, which are cultural, so you can't touch those. So he was able to purchase the cenote, dredged it out, and then through these like crazy legal loopholes with the director of the Peabody, he was able to send the most important collection, whatever, to the Peabody, no? So the installation that I'm making is because the cenote, its function is it's a ritual site for Chak, the rain god, Mayan rain god. And so I looked through the correspondence of Chak and, not Chak, yes, I wish. Through the correspondence between the director of the Peabody and Thompson, this guy who dredged it, who actually was a consul, U.S. consul. So they're not emailing, sending letters back and forth, just basically trying to, figure out how to move them. But in those letters, you can actually see different manifestations of water and rain. Because, for example, there's these notes that are like, I'm sorry I couldn't write to you because the water is so strong that my hands are getting destroyed. Or like, today, there's actually this amazing letter of a woman who is writing and she's saying, I was taking these objects and then there was the biggest hailstorm in the world that I have ever seen. And so like, it took these objects and I lost them. So it got thrown, like somehow the water just took them away because it was so crazy. And then you can actually see raindrops in the letters themselves. So that it's actually melting some of the ink of the correspondence between. So I was looking at this for these different manifestations of Chak to like, see like, because I wanted to figure out how to litigate for him. Like if I was a lawyer, like how could I be like, hey, you humans, you stole my shit because that's my ritual stuff. Because he's still around, you know what I mean? Like there's no end to a spiritual life. And so then in a sense, it was to make a spiritual litigation and also a material argument, because once the objects were taken out of the water, they started deteriorating. So one of the main things about this conversation between them two is that they're trying to figure out how to conserve them once they're being taken out, because for 1,000 years they've been perfectly preserved underwater, but now that they're touching air, they're falling apart, no? So that was part of the work, that was like how to get one from the other, to the other. And this will be the installation if I can make it, but TBD,
Well, it's really interesting, even, just as research,
Yeah, that's what I mean. I was like, the research is good enough, but now it's like, how do you make it into a shape when like nobody's making anything? You know what I mean? Because I actually, the last 3 months that I was supposed to be at Harvard was to, I talked to the director, and my first proposal was for her to deaccession some of these works to actually drop them back into the cenote. I'll be like, you'd be the most amazing lady ever if you actually acknowledge the fact that these objects might still be functioning in that sense, no? And of course she said no, but then the installation sort of became, how do we negotiate between, what the best case scenario is, and this potential installation, which was to scan all, we agreed on 100 artifacts to be casted in ice. And so like it's in this installation and water comes down and like the ice it goes back and melts, no? But
yeah,
maybe that's like a draft. So next. And then finally, this is also very proposal, which is working with these bodies in different collections, because bodies also are this weird category where when they're old enough, a person like a physical body stops being a person and becomes an object, categorically because of institutions. And that's why we're able to see like skulls in museums and stuff. And so I'm working with body parts in different collections just to see when did it happen. And to try, this specific installation will be in Seoul, not in Seoul, in Korea, at the Gwangju Biennial, which will be to contact the afterlife inside of the collection to be like, hey, your body's in this box. Where would you rather be? So in a sense, I'm using the process of anchromancy, which is like a mixture of ink. What is this called? I'm blanking on the process. It's ink print. Like when you have a little puddle of water and then you drop ink, is like sumi nagashi and paper marbling, which is like a really unstable, like you can't actually control so much the image which you make. So I thought that it's like, okay, if the ink there's this thing called anchromancy, which is basically divination through ink stains. So a mixture of like contacting the afterlife, to ask them where they would rather be, this process that is very difficult to control by a human, and like the image will be made by air or whatever, and then it will make this print that potentially will look like a geographic location in which hypothetically this body will go, But that's also TBD. Anyway, that's
we have to look forward to. And we have just about 10 minutes or so left before Instagram will cut us off, that we can get to the questions. One of the questions that I had for you is, because your work deals with these existing objects and collections, and also making something new, I'm curious about your thoughts on those distinctions. And I don't know if authorship is the right question, but how you navigate, you're doing projects that are kind of half curatorial, and also their own works. If that makes sense.
Yes. I think for me, it's the objects themselves are already existing in the system in which the institutions already place on them, whether it's like historical institution or the museum itself, or even the perception by an audience. It's also like, your preconceived notion of an object comes with like already it will define what that object is. And for me, it's not necessarily that I'm trying to curate those things. It's more like question the gaps in which the legitimate sounding versions are, and sort of say, maybe it's okay not to know, or at least don't say that 100%, so then there is open to more different versions of interpreting. So in a sense, when I think about authoring, it's like, not necessarily that the object itself that I make is just sort of a placeholder to hold the idea, which is just basically make room for other historical narratives. But in a sense, the ones I make are like really not looking like very official for that reason, like I said, with the abstract shape, because once the audience is like looking at something that is not very familiar looking in the terms of like, this object needs to look like artifact, this object needs to be like a perfect pot. And when you're confronted with a different shape that might not be familiar in this specific context, then you could be like, why did I think that a cup was always going to be the legit, the actual version, when it's impossible to actually know what that was unless we figure out how to like time travel for real, which would be cool. But that's for future research.
Well, for now, we can't travel outside our apartment. So
I know, that's why I'm talking. I'm like, I don't know if I'm going crazy, but I'm like, I would so like to just travel next door.
And we have an interesting question on whether you've spoken with the Fowler about how your exhibit might have changed how they show artifacts.
Interesting question. Yes. So since then, I have actually been working a lot with the Fowler because it's actually like my home team museum. I've been going there since I was very young. And I'm actually going to make an exhibition with them in 2022, I hope. But the way that the exhibit might have changed how they show artifacts. It's not necessarily that it's the display itself. It's more like the registrar. For me, when I work with these collections, I think of the people working inside of the institution as the first audience, because they are the ones who are actually categorizing all of these things. So for me, the registrar is really important because they are actually deciding, how to catalog all of these things that will actually have an impact on the way that this object is framed even longer than the original author. And so then in a sense, maybe some of the works that I have made has really just questioned how collections exist in the paperwork form, like in the structure of how things are cataloged or how they're conserved or the background people. And so for me, it's always like when I plan all of these collection shows, is really like, how can I make a show where the registrar is actually like one of the main audiences, or the conservator, or that, like they would actually have to really think about how they're actually affecting this object in its life, And then as an audience, you like can see that sort of system also. But for me, I was like, I'm going to make it work for you.
Great. And that question we can revisit from earlier, which was about how your work may intervene in kind of a line of other artists who have been doing research or making work about pre-Columbian objects and culture.
Yeah, I think for me, it's not necessarily like, I am very interested in pre-Columbian objects specifically, but it's mostly the systems in which other historical objects are displayed, probably in collections here in the U.S. for the most part, no? So in a sense, it's just not necessarily that it's the, pre-Columbian objects just happens to be a default, like a placeholder, which it's my first choice, of course, to see the entire structure in which they are moved and exist. But that happens with every single historical object that exists. You know what I mean? It's like every single historical object that is in a museum has gone through all of these systems. I just have to pick one.
And so does contemporary art.
Exactly. So does contemporary art. So that, like I also I curated the show at MoCA that was thinking about those specific questions, but translated into contemporary time, which the only difference is that the author is still alive to be like, no, don't do it like that. Or here's what I actually want. And so then you can actually feel the time difference between like this object that is so old that now through all of this historical life is so separate from my original intention or function or whatever, which we have no idea, to current day when the author is like, before I die, I want to leave all of this information. Because I think about that a lot for my own work, where it's like, how much information can I leave so my work doesn't, 1,000 years from now, is like not bull.
Right. And I'm curious, what are your references for your work besides, institutionally, if there are other artists that you look to, or whether it's a different media?
I honestly would rather look at other fields. I feel like I'm still stuck in like Radcliffe Brain, which was this fellowship that I was doing at Harvard, where it's like all of these people with different methodologies are like trying to ask questions about similar subjects. So then in a sense, that is what is interesting to me, where it's like, how do you do that in like social science? How would a social scientist make a work of art? Because it is just sort of organizing. But I think that in terms of like methodology, what is what I like to think about, it's like instead of thinking about like sculpture, drawing, painting, ceramic, it could be like science, history, archaeology, so instead of the method being a material method, it could be just like the framing and methodology of another way, but applied into the arts, because the arts is definitely not as uptight as all of these other fields. You know what I mean? In terms of like the way that it has to be like presented and specific. Yeah, I mean, obviously those things have a value, but in a sense, the arts feels like the space in between where you can just like jiggle stuff and be like, why? That makes no sense that you would do stuff like that. But yeah.
And yes, this is Theo. He loves contemporary art and pre-Columbian as well. There's a question here on whether you would be interested in working with a private collection of pre-Columbian objects that might have a fraught history, which yes, public collections do as well.
Yes.
So how you'd go about it.
I actually have been, since I've been working with these collections, there has been times in which private collectors have been like, I have one of these ceramics at my house, can you make a commission or something like that? But the most interesting work that I have worked with is with this Bergman board. So there was this collector in LA who had all of these, a giant collection. So when he died, his kids got a third, or something like that. And one of them didn't know what to do with it. So they invited artists to like be like, what do I do with this thing? And so in that sense, I ended up working with this shrunken head. And that's actually where the idea, because that's when I started thinking about the differences between, like, this is actually a head of a person that is now in my studio, but now is categorized as an object and somebody can own it. Why is that? So in a sense, I wanted to first treat it like a fresh dead person. So it's like, what happens if I so I ended up calling the coroner to be like, I have this head, and police. And so then in a sense, it was like, once I explained to them that it was not a fresh body, but like an ancient body, then it was a whole nother set of categories in which the procedural and categorization needed to happen, right? But in terms of the collector, it just, they're only going to have this collection for a very short amount of time. And the way that philanthropy has worked, it definitely has changed a lot from this like altruistic, can't even be altruistic all the way because you get a giant tax write-off. But it was anonymous for the most part, you know what I mean? So in a sense, it's just like now there's all of these collectors who are building their legacies off of these collections that don't belong to them. And so in a sense, it makes me sort of anxious because, like collectors are buying my work, and then like what is going to happen in the future when the collection becomes its own individual work also. You know what I mean? For example, the Stuart Gardner Museum, like none of those things can ever be moved. And so it's like, is this a giant sculpture with found arts that now is decorating that? It's definitely something but all of those things are made with contracts, you know what I mean? So it's basically saying there's this legal framework in which we somehow, it's so difficult for artists to think about the law all the time. And that's why I was like, I should make a project about it. So I forced myself to think about the law. Because once you set up this sort of structure, if you don't know, then somebody who knows will be able to like actually use your work as found material to make their own work, which could be cool, but I think there's a lot of consent to thing, or like that it would ever expire, you know what I mean? Like Stuart Gardner is not around anymore, and I was like, I was thinking when I went to see it, I was like, what if I had one of my works in this collection and I really, really, really do not like the way that it's hung or like displayed next to this other work I don't like or whatever, no? And so in a sense, in a normal world, you would think like, okay, that eventually will expire and then the piece will be released and then it will have its own next collector or next life or whatever. But then it actually changes at some point. So there's the possibility of it changing in context, whereas if there's like Proctor Stafford or Stuart Gardner, these institutions who are like actually holding it in cryo-freeze zone.
Right. And we could keep talking. I know I have more questions. There are more questions in the comments, but Instagram limits us to an hour and we'll be cut off in a second. So I just wanted to thank you, Gala, for joining us, and everybody who has been watching. You can follow her Instagram, see what else she's up to. Hopefully we'll get to see some of these upcoming projects.
Oh, I hope so too.